right. Thank you guys again for meeting on Zoom. As far as Monday, so I got a COVID test yesterday and should hear back by tonight. Hopefully it's negative. I'll email you guys tonight or tomorrow early to let you know what we're doing Monday, but hopefully we'll be back to the normal schedule, which would mean we'd be back on the green week, but I'll email you guys to make sure everyone knows how they're meeting next week if we can meet in person. So just keep an eye out for that email. And let's see, you have two things due Monday as a reminder. The Chapter 2 outline, which you can upload to that assignment Dropbox on Canvas. So make sure you get that done by Monday by the start of class, 10 a.m. And also, if you haven't turned it in already, your the ranking for the different diseases for your disease video project. So that'll be due, I think I have that set for the end of day. So you have until like 11:59 to upload that spreadsheet with your rankings. So don't forget to do those two things on or by Monday. And let's see, that's all that we have upcoming for now. As far as lab goes, don't forget to take the lab quiz by the start of your lab period. So if you're on Monday at 2:30, take the quiz before Monday at 2:30 p.m., no matter if you're set to come at 2:30 or 3:30, like the first or second section. I put a bunch of documents on Canvas that will hopefully help. It's basically answers to the review sheets at the end of each of those labs in your lab manual, as well as answers to some of those in-class activities. So there's a lot of documents under the lab 1 and 2 module in the lab section, the lab course on Canvas. So check those out and let me know if you guys have any questions. All right. If there are no questions right now, I'm going to go ahead and jump back into the some of the basics of chemistry, and then we're going to get into some chemical bonds here pretty quickly. All right. So I think we ended on this slide, the valence shell. So I basically said the take-home message here is depending on how many electrons are in that outermost shell, that is what's going to determine how and what other atoms a particular atom will bond with. So the goal for pretty much every atom we're talking about is to have 8 electrons in their outermost shell. Hydrogen's that one exception because it's a tiny little atom. It only has one energy shell, which only needs 2 electrons in it to be filled. So hydrogen only needs 1 to fill its valence shell. Okay, so 8 electrons is usually the goal, and that will determine how atoms bond with each other. How we determine the number of valence electrons is actually pretty simple. You may or may not be familiar, or maybe just slightly familiar with the periodic table of the elements, but it's laid out in a really helpful way for many purposes. For our purpose, it's really helpful from the perspective of figuring out how many valence electrons any given atom has. So we know how many it needs to fill its valence shell. Hydrogen we know all about already. It only has 1 electron and needs 1 electron to fill its shell. So that's an easy one. Oh, and for the most part, we're going to ignore the vast majority of the periodic table. So I know this looks like a lot of stuff, but I should have actually blacked out a little bit more of it, but we're ignoring that whole middle part and those 2 bottom rows at the bottom here. Just ignore those. We're going to focus on a very small piece of the periodic table just because, as I talked about earlier, certain elements are very prevalent in the human body, whereas others pretty much are not found or are found in extremely tiny amounts. So we're going to focus on just a very few atoms here, very few elements in the periodic table. So how do we tell how many valence electrons there are? Basically, the column, whatever column the element is in, will tell us how many valence electrons it has. So for example, this first column hydrogen, lithium, sodium, potassium, all the way down. Again, we're not really focusing on most of these. There's one valence electron. So ignore the one on the top. That'll kind of throw you off once we get over here. But that Roman numeral 1, you can ignore the A as well. That's not an I. Well, I guess it is an I. It's a Roman numeral I, which is 1. That tells us that there is one valence electron in all of these elements. Hydrogen's the only one with just the one energy shell. Lithium and sodium we'll talk about a good bit. So sodium has 3 energy shells, but in its outermost energy shell, which is the one we're concerned about, it only has 1 electron. That means it needs 7 to fill it. Or the alternative is it gets rid of that one, and I'll talk about that when we talk about ionic bonds. Okay, so anyway, take home message, that first column, there's 1 valence electron. If we then, I'm gonna get the chat box out of the way here. If we go over to the other side of the periodic table and we look at the second to last column, here you'll see VII, that's 7 in Roman numerals. That means this whole column, these elements have 7 valence electrons. So 7 electrons in their outermost shell, which means they only need 1. So these elements and atoms are very reactive. So chlorine we'll see when we deal with table salt in the ionic bond example. It's really highly reactive because it just needs that 1 electron. It's pretty easy to fill, so it'll react with a lot of different atoms. So it's pretty simple to sort of break down how many valence electrons there are. So oxygen, so these 3, you're going to want to circle these, C, N, and O, well, mostly C and O, but C, N, O, these 3 elements you want to be really familiar with, along with hydrogen. So those 4 are ones that you'll want to know how many valence electrons there are just sort of off the top of your head. I'll provide you with a periodic table so you can figure it out, but it'll be easier if you just kind of memorize those 4 and how many valence electrons they have. So oxygen has 6. Here we see the VI. That means 6 valence electrons. It needs 2 more. Nitrogen has 5. Carbon has 4. So it's in order. So if we go, this column has 1 valence electron, the first one. The second column has 2 valence electrons. Jump over here. That's why we're ignoring that whole middle part, that big black box that I put over it. This column has 3 valence electrons, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then this final column here, we never deal with because they're very unreactive because they already have a full valence shell of 8 electrons. And those are called the noble gases, in case you're curious, but they don't really react with a whole lot. Okay, so C, N, and O, you want to be really familiar with their valence electrons as well as hydrogen. So that's how we determine the number of valence electrons, which helps us determine how those atoms will react and bond with other atoms. Okay, moving into the chemical bonds part. So now we're going to talk about 4 types of chemical bonds, which are this is hopefully a review somewhat from at least some bio class you've had, if it's general bio at Piedmont or general bio somewhere else. Hopefully you've at least seen these terms before, or maybe chemistry. You may have come across them in chemistry class. So what we're talking about now is where these atoms are going to form the chemical bonds based on their valence, the number of their valence electrons. So I'll run through each of these that are bullet pointed. So there's the covalent bonds. Those are going to be the strongest. Ionic bonds, hydrogen bonds, and van der Waals forces. Van der Waals are the weakest. So these are listed in strongest to weakest generally order. So I'm going to go through each of these and talk about the characteristics of each type of bond and give you some examples. First, we have the covalent bonds. Covalent bonds you want to definitely be very comfortable with. These happen very frequently in biological molecules, and they're really important because they're really strong. So what a covalent bond is where 2 or more atoms come together and they share electrons. So they don't transfer electrons, they just share them. So each of them, if we're just talking about 2 atoms, for instance, both of those atoms, by sharing, have a full valence electron shell. So if we look down here at the hydrogen, this really simple hydrogen atom, remember hydrogen only has one energy level. It can only hold 2 electrons. A hydrogen atom on its own has 1 electron. So if you get 2 hydrogen atoms together, you put 2 together, they share their electrons, which you can see here on the right side. So 2 H's bonded together means now this hydrogen has 2 electrons and this hydrogen has 2 electrons. They're the same 2 electrons because they're sharing, but that makes them happy. That is considered a full valence shell for both of them. So H2 is hydrogen gas, so it's very easily formed. If there's 2 hydrogen atoms around, they will likely bond with each other. This is also a really difficult bond to break. So it's very strong. It usually requires some kind of enzyme to break it. And an enzyme, I think I sort of defined earlier, but it's simply a protein that helps speed up some process or reaction. So I'll talk more about those as we get into the protein section. But covalent bonds, very strong, and they involve sharing of electrons. Those are the take-home messages for covalent bonds overall. Within that category of covalent bonds, we have 2 sort of subtypes. A covalent bond can either be polar or nonpolar. And whether it's polar or nonpolar depends on how equally those electrons are shared. So just because 2 atoms are sharing electrons doesn't mean the electrons that each atom is holding on to them equally as strongly, if that makes sense. There can be unequal sharing. So first, let's talk about the nonpolar covalent bond. That is where there is equal sharing of electrons. So one atom doesn't necessarily hold on to the electrons more tightly than the other. This happens a lot when it's the same atom bonding together. So the same element, 2 atoms of the same element bonding together. So here you can see 2 carbons bonding together. Neither of them is going to hold on to the electrons any more strongly because they have that same pull on the electrons. It's the same atom. So they have an equal pull on the electrons. So that's nonpolar. So there's no charge. There's no partial negative or partial positive. It's totally neutral. When we look at a polar covalent bond, that's not the case. So a polar covalent bond is shown down here where electrons are actually shared unequally between the 2 atoms. And these are always going to be different elements that are bonded together. If you have 2 of the same element bonded together, it's going to be nonpolar no matter what, because they're sharing the electrons equally. In this case, where you have an oxygen and a hydrogen bonding together, the oxygen is greedier for the electrons. So it pulls those electrons closer into it. And this is due to something called electronegativity, which I'm not going to get into here, but just understand that some atoms are better at holding on to the electrons a little bit more tightly because they're greedy for them. Oxygen is one of those. So oxygen pulls the electrons closer to it. So they're still sharing electrons. The O and the H are sharing electrons, but the electrons are slightly shifted in space towards oxygen. That pulls, since the electrons are closer to oxygen, that means this oxygen is slightly negatively charged. So you see down here, this delta symbol, you don't have to worry about that, but notice that this negative symbol here. So this means it's partially negative. Over here, that leaves hydrogen partially positive. So whichever atom the electrons are a little bit closer to, whichever atom is greedier for those electrons, that's going to be the partially negative side of the polar covalent bond. And the other side by default is going to be partially positive. So a polar covalent bond, a polar molecule, it just means there is a section of it that is slightly negative, and there's a section of it that's slightly positive. In a nonpolar molecule or a nonpolar covalent bond, there's none of that. It's all, for our purposes, for the most part, neutral. Okay, you definitely want to make sure you understand that difference between polar and nonpolar molecules. That will come up again when we talk about water, as well as when we talk about the biological macromolecules. So polar versus nonpolar. Okay. Those are the covalent bonds. That's all the detail I'm going to go into. I think that's all the information you really need to understand about covalent bonds, to understand the human anatomy side of things. There's a lot more to it, but that's for a chemistry class. All right, on to ionic bonds, our next large category of chemical bonds. So now with ionic bonds, rather than electrons being shared, they're completely transferred from one atom to another. So rather than sharing, it's a transfer of electrons. That's an important difference. It makes it a slightly weaker bond, but it's still pretty strong. When one electron is donated to another, from one atom to another, those atoms are considered ionized. So I have that term here. So ionization is the creation of ions, basically. And ions are charged atoms. In any ionic bond, you have one positively charged atom and one negatively charged atom. The negatively charged atom is the electron acceptor, and that's called an anion. So anion, negative charge, it takes on the electron that was donated. The molecule that's donating the electron then becomes positively charged, and it's called the cation. So cation and anion, you always have those paired up in an ionic bond. So if we look down here at NaCl, which is table salt, we have the Na atom and the Cl atom. If we look at the outermost shell of each, so Na, sodium, has one little electron in its outermost shell. So that means it would need seven more electrons to fill up its outermost shell. That's a lot of work to get 7 more electrons just to fill that outermost shell. So it's actually easier to just kick that electron out. That energy shell will then disappear, and its second energy shell already has 8 electrons in it, so it will have a full valence shell once it gets rid of this electron in its shell. So it transfers and donates its electron over to chlorine. So if we look at chlorine's valence shell, we notice it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Chlorine has 7 valence electrons, which means it just needs one more. So that's a pretty easy job to fill its valence shell. So that electron from sodium goes over to chlorine, then they're both happy. Sodium has a full valence shell, chlorine has a full valence shell. So you can see over here, now sodium just has those 2 shells. Chlorine has its full outer shell, the third shell now. And you can see the plus and the minus. So sodium is going to be positively charged because it got rid of an electron. And remember, electrons are negatively charged. So if you get rid of a negative charge, that means the charge of that atom is now more positive. Chlorine took on that negative charge, that electron, so it becomes the anion and is negatively charged. I think that's the most important parts. Oh, other than this, the final bullet point I have here, these are pretty strong, fairly strong bonds, but they are easily broken by water. So ionic bonds can be broken down by water. It's easy to dissolve salt in water, right? So that's a good example of an ionic bond being broken down by water. And that is all I'm going to talk about with ionic bonds. Those are the main points you need to know for ionic bonding. Now, hydrogen bonds. These, along with covalent bonds, are probably the 2 most important from a biological perspective. So you definitely want to understand covalent bonds, polar and nonpolar, as well as hydrogen bonds. And hydrogen bonds actually relate back to polar covalent bonds. So I'm going to describe here what a hydrogen bond is. It obviously involves a hydrogen atom. So if we look at a polar covalent molecule, so we have water here two H's and an O, that's H2O, which is water. Those hydrogens are bonded covalently to the oxygen. So they're sharing electrons with the oxygen. The oxygen, remember, is pretty greedy for electrons. So it's pulling the electrons closer towards it. So if we go over here to this diagram on the right, you can see this oxygen molecule, this side of the water, or this oxygen atom, this side of the water molecule is slightly negatively charged. So O, slightly negative, that leaves the hydrogen slightly positive. And same here, obviously on this, for all water molecules are the same. So since that oxygen is slightly negative and the hydrogen of another water molecule is slightly positive, they become attracted to each other. So this negative oxygen on this water molecule, this positive hydrogen on this water molecule, they are going to be attracted to each other, and that's a hydrogen bond. So a hydrogen bond is where there's a slightly positive hydrogen in one molecule being attracted to a slightly negative atom, doesn't have to be oxygen, but a slightly negative atom in another water molecule that is involved in a polar covalent bond. If you have a nonpolar molecule, so imagine, let's say we have this water molecule here, the upper left one, and we have the positive and negative side. If this were a different molecule in the middle here that was nonpolar, there would be no charge. So these would not be attracted to each other. So you have to have two molecules that are have a polar covalent bond in order to have a hydrogen bond. You have to have that partial positive attracted to the partial negative of another molecule. Okay. So hydrogen bonds, do I have something else on these? No. Okay. I'll talk more about hydrogen bonds when we get into some of the protein folding as well as DNA. So DNA is held together in large part by hydrogen bonds, as well as a lot of proteins when they fold over on each other. Those folds are held together through hydrogen bonds. So hydrogen bonds are really, really important. And then on to the final type of bond, or this is really just, I guess, an attractive force. I'm not sure if it's technically a bond. Van der Waals forces. So these are just, they're very weak and very brief attractions between two atoms. This can happen even in non-polar atoms. So the hydrogen bonding, you have to have polar molecules being attracted to each other. If you have, say, a non-polar molecules or non-polar atoms, they can still be attracted to each other because although I've simplified the idea of a non-polar molecule, the reality is that these electrons, so they're, maybe they're equally shared between a couple of atoms in a molecule. In reality, that the charge is sort of ever shifting because the electrons in the electron cloud are kind of spinning all around, moving to one side of the atom or the molecule and then moving to the other side, just for our purposes by chance and kind of randomly. So that creates, if you look down here, sometimes the electrons will be all on the right side of an atom, leaving the positive charges in the nucleus all on the left side of the atom. That means there is sort of a shift in charge. So that shift in charge actually allows for attraction to another atom kind of in that same setup where you have this positive nucleus attracted to this now high negative density electron cloud here. So what this comes down to is electrons constantly shifting and fluctuating in their position around an atom. That fluctuation is going to allow for really brief attractions, and then the electrons will shift again and they'll become not attracted to each other anymore. And then maybe that second shift will attract another atom to it, and then that'll break as the electrons move, and it's just kind of constantly shifting and fluctuating. So this is also really important in protein folding. So hydrogen bonds, as well as van der Waals forces are helping these proteins stay together, and the folding of a protein allows for its functionality. So we'll get into that, but that's where van der Waals forces in particular come in the human body when we talk about protein folding. Okay. So now before we move into information on water, what I want you guys to do rather than kind of just plowing through, oh, sorry. Yep, I can slow down, sorry. I'll slow down a little bit. So what I'm gonna have you guys do is actually practice some of these chemical bonds. I have a document, so if you go to Canvas, there is a document under the Unit 1 module. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute here. There's a document under the Unit 1 module called Chem Bond Table. And I will show you what it looks like. If you guys can download that right now, I'm going to put you in breakout groups to fill it out. It's kind of a partially completed table with these 4 different bond types. And hopefully this will be a useful study tool for you. So here we have, you can see there's 4 different rows, basically, 1 for each of the bond types. I've filled in some of the information and given you examples, pictorial examples of each one. So I'll wait for you guys to download that and get it, and then I'll split you into breakout rooms, and you can at least fill out a few of the rows with each other and then finish it on your own. Okay, so what I want you guys to do when I put you into the breakout rooms is fill in any of these empty boxes. So you should have 1 of each bond type here. So these are all 4 bond types. Covalent I've already put in for you. And then a description for each. So I would suggest not writing exactly what I have on the slide, but rather describing it in your own words. So something that will help you in a way that you can understand it. And if you can't do that, if you don't have enough understanding yet for how to put it into your own words, you can write down what I have on the slide. But as you go back and kind of look at this again and try to understand these bonds a little bit more, being able to describe them in your own words and not just basically restating exactly what I said will be really helpful for you. And then the strength, so weak or strong. And I put a couple of those in already. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing this right now and put you guys in breakout rooms. I'm probably going to give you about 3 minutes. I know it's not very long, but at least get a couple of these rows filled in, and maybe focus on the ones that are a little bit tougher to understand. Oh, where's the sheet? Did you guys find the document? Did I put it up for you? I hope I did.
Yes, you did.
Okay, good. So yeah, it's under modules. If you go to modules, it is at it's at the bottom of mine of Unit 1 intro. It should say Chem Bond Table.docx. So it's a Word document. Oh, you're fine. That's okay. Okay, so I'm going to put you in breakout groups and fill out what you can in a few minutes. I'll put you in groups of, let's see, we'll do 3 to 4. Okay. Yep, fill out what you can, and then I'll bring you guys back and we'll talk about a few of them. And so let's look at this table together. So who wants to offer up? Oh wait, let me bring up the chat box here if I can find it. Come on. Ugh. Hang on. Here we go. So for the first row here with this example, can anyone tell me what kind of bond that is?
Hydrogen.
Yep, that's a hydrogen bond. Awesome, because you have this positively, it doesn't have the positive notation here, but you know this is polar. And then this is also a polar molecule. So that hydrogen is positive. It's slightly attracted to this slightly negative nitrogen. So that's a hydrogen bond. And this is an example where it's not two water molecules. Okay, I'm not going to ask for descriptions because that takes a bit too long. Is a covalent bond strong or weak? What do you guys put here?
Strong.
Strong, yeah. So covalent bonds are really strong, as are the next kind. What did you guys have for this bond type here with the Na and the Cl?
Ionic bond.
Yep, ionic. So that's an ionic bond where you have a cation positive and an anion negative. And then what's this last one where you have this shift in electron densities where you have this slight attraction every once in a while? What's this last type of bond down here? It's a weird name.
Van der Waals.
Yeah, van der Waals. Thanks, Grace. So van der Waals forces is that's the last row here. Okay. So finish filling that out if you haven't completed it, just on your own. You don't have to turn it in. This is really just for your studying purposes. And fill in a description, like I said, in your own words would be most useful if you're not able to. Just, write down what I said or what is on my slides and kind of go from there. And if over time you understand it a little bit better, then fill in that description in your own words. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing that and go back to here. So those are the main types of bonds. Now we're going to get into some characteristics of water. And this is really, oh yeah, I am sharing. Okay. I'm not going to go into tons of detail about this, but just understand that water is obviously extremely important for all life. And the properties of water allow it to basically sustain life on Earth. These 4 properties that I've listed here are talked about in this video that I'm going to show you. So rather than me going through them, I think this video does a really good job of explaining them. So first off, water dissolves a lot of things. That makes it a really good solvent. It's cohesive. That means it's one water molecule is attracted to another water molecule. So it's attracted to itself. Adhesion is where water molecules are attracted to other polar items, other polar substances. And there's an example of that in the video. So cohesion and adhesion. And then thermal stability is really important, especially in the sense of a human body. So it helps, water can basically take on a lot of heat or let go of a lot of heat, and it doesn't really change temperature, which helps our body stay about the same temperature since we're about 75% water. It helps us stay stable from a thermal perspective, thermal stability. So we're going to watch this video. I don't think we'll get through all of it, but we'll get through kind of the main pieces of it. No, shoot, I don't have it queued up. Sorry, hang on.
And breathe out of bed, you're down, hit breathe here, down, 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 make it up.
Sorry. Oh, goodness. All right, let's try that again, and then I'll share it, I promise.
At H&R Block, get your maximum refund guaranteed.
Gotta get through some ads first. Oh my gosh. Okay. Let me share this with you guys. All right, here we go.
Hello there. Here at Crash Course HQ, we like to start out each day with a nice, healthy dose of water in all its three forms. It is the only substance on all of our planet Earth that occurs naturally in solid, liquid, and gas forms. And to celebrate this magical bond between two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom, here today we are going to be celebrating the wonderful life-sustaining properties of water. But we're going to do it slightly more clothed. Much better. When we left off here at the biology crash course, we were talking about life, and the rather important fact that all life as we know it is dependent upon there being water around. Scientists and astronomers are always looking out into the universe, trying to figure out whether there is life elsewhere, because, you know, that is kind of the most important question that we have right now. They're always getting really excited when they find water someplace, particularly liquid water. And this is one reason why I and so many other people geeked out so hard last December when Mars's 7-year-old rover Opportunity found a 20-inch long vein of gypsum that was almost certainly deposited by long-term liquid water on the surface of Mars. And this was probably billions of years ago, and so it's going to be hard to tell whether or not the water that was there resulted in some life. But maybe we can figure that out, and that would be really exciting. But why? Why do we think that water is necessary for life? Why does water on other planets get us so freaking excited? So let's start out by investigating some of the amazing properties of water. In order to do that, we're going to have to start out with this. The world's most popular molecule, or at least the world's most memorized molecule. We all know about it. Good old H2O. 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. The hydrogens each sharing an electron with oxygen in what we call a covalent bond. So as you can see, I've drawn my water molecule in a particular way, and this is actually the way that it appears. It is V-shaped. Because this big ol' oxygen atom is a little bit more greedy for electrons, it has a slight negative charge, whereas this area here with the hydrogen atoms has a slight positive charge. Thanks to this polarity, all water molecules are attracted to one another. So much so that they actually stick together, and these are called hydrogen bonds, and we talked about them last time. But essentially what happens is that the positive pole around those hydrogen atoms bonds to the negative pole around the oxygen atoms of a different water molecule, and so it's a weak bond. But look! They're bonding! Seriously, I cannot overstate the importance of this hydrogen bond. So when your teacher asks you, what's important about water? Start out with the hydrogen bonds, and you should put it in all caps and maybe some sparkles around it. One of the cool properties that results from these hydrogen bonds is a high cohesion for water, which results in high surface tension. Cohesion is the attraction between two like things, like attraction between one molecule of water and another molecule of water. Water has the highest cohesion of any non-metallic liquid, and you can see this if you put some water on some wax paper or some Teflon, or something where the water beads up, like some leaves of plants do it really well. It's quite cool. Since water adheres weakly to the wax paper or to the plant, but strongly to itself, the water molecules are holding those droplets together in a configuration that creates the least amount of surface area. It's this high surface tension that allows some bugs, and even I think one lizard, and also one Jesus, to be able to walk on water. The cohesive force of water does have its limits, of course. There are other substances that water quite likes to stick to. Take glass, for example. This is called adhesion, and the water is spreading out here instead of beating up because the adhesive forces between the water and the glass are stronger than the cohesive forces of the individual water molecules in the bead of water. Adhesion is attraction between two different substances, so in this case, the water molecules and the glass molecules. These properties lead to one of my favorite things about water, the fact that it can defy gravity. That really cool thing that just happened is called capillary action. And explaining it can be easily done with what we now know about cohesion and adhesion. Thanks to adhesion, the water molecules are attracted to the molecules in the straw. But as the water molecules adhere to the straw, other molecules are drawn in by cohesion, following those fellow water molecules. Thank you, cohesion. The surface tension created here causes the water to climb up the straw. And it will continue to climb until eventually gravity, pulling down on the weight of the water in the straw, overpowers the surface tension. The fact that water is a polar molecule also makes it really good at dissolving things, which we call it's a good solvent then. Scratch that. Water isn't a good solvent. It's an amazing solvent. There are more substances that can be dissolved in water than in any other liquid on Earth. And yes, that includes the strongest acid that we have ever created. These substances that dissolve in water, sugar or salt being ones that we're familiar with, are called hydrophilic. And they are hydrophilic because they are polar, and their polarity is stronger than the cohesive forces of the water. So when you get one of these polar substances in water, it's strong enough that it breaks all the little cohesive forces, all those little hydrogen bonds, and instead of hydrogen bonding to each other, the water will hydrogen bond around these polar substances. Table salt is ionic, and right now it's being separated into ions as the poles of our water molecules interact with it. But what happens when there is a molecule that cannot break the cohesive forces of water? It can't penetrate and come into it. Basically, what happens when that substance can't overcome the strong cohesive forces of water and can't get inside of the water? That's when we get what we call a hydrophobic substance, or something that is fearful of water. These molecules lack charged poles. They are non-polar and are not dissolving in water because, essentially, they're being pushed out of the water by water's cohesive forces. Water, we may call it the universal solvent, but that does not mean that it dissolves everything.
Okay, we're gonna stop there. Take a look at the rest of that video if you want to. I think the only characteristic of water that he didn't mention, or that he didn't get to in that part of the video, which he does get to, is the thermal stability, which is pretty important. But I kind of described that, just the idea that water doesn't change temperature very quickly. It can take on a lot of energy and release a lot of energy without a whole lot of change in temperature, which is important, like I said, to maintain our temperature homeostasis. So that link is in the PowerPoint if you want to watch the rest of that video. And then, like I said, Monday, I'll email you guys about what we're doing with Monday next week. And other than that, have a good weekend, and I'll see you in one form or another on Monday.